On the night of June 7th, 2026, a Ukrainian drone unit called Code 9, 2, working alongside the 1st Separate Assault Battalion, sent a wave of homemade Firepoint drones and a new long-range aircraft called the Behemoth toward a narrow strip of asphalt near a village most people outside Ukraine had never heard of. That village is called Chonhar. Within minutes, the deck of the Chonhar road bridge, one of the handful of physical connections between occupied Crimea and the rest of Russian-held southern Ukraine, was cratered and burning. The Ukrainian military confirmed the strike and released footage. On the other side, Vladimir Saldo, the Russian-installed head of the occupied part of Kherson region, admitted the bridge had been hit and announced that traffic through the nearby Dzhankoi checkpoint, one of the main crossing points linking Crimea to the mainland, was being suspended, in his words, for security reasons. That single sentence tells you almost everything about why this story matters. When the men running an occupied territory start shutting down their own checkpoints, it is not a symbolic gesture. It is triage. Now, before we go further, let's deal directly with the number in the title, because a serious channel owes its audience honesty, not just excitement. You will see figures like 50,000, 90,000, even over 100,000 troops floating around online in connection with this story. Some of those numbers come from military bloggers and open-source commentary sites making educated estimates. None of them, as of the time this script was researched, has been officially confirmed by a named government body, by the Ukrainian General Staff, or by Western Defense Intelligence, as an exact count of troops dependent on one specific road. What has been confirmed through named sources including the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense, Reuters, the Institute for the Study of War, and Ukraine's own military is something almost as dramatic and arguably more important because it's real. Ukraine has spent the summer of 2026 running a deliberate, sustained campaign to sever the road and rail arteries that keep Russian forces in southern Ukraine fed, fueled, and armed. Whether the true number sustained by that network is 30,000, 50,000, or more, the story underneath the headline is the one worth understanding, and that's the story we're going to walk through together. To understand why a bridge near Chonhar matters this much, you have to understand geography, because geography is the one thing in this war that never changes, no matter who's winning on a given week. Crimea is a peninsula. It hangs off the bottom of Ukraine, connected to the mainland by only a narrow strip of land, an isthmus at its northern edge. There are a handful of physical routes across that isthmus. The Chonhar crossing is one, the Armyansk crossing further west is another. The Kerch Bridge, running the other direction, connects Crimea directly to Russia itself across the strait. Since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and especially since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022, this narrow footprint of roads, railways, and bridges has functioned as Russia's logistics spine for its entire southern military effort. Fuel, ammunition, replacement vehicles, food, medical supplies, and troop rotations for the fronts in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia all move in one way or another through this bottleneck. When you choke a bottleneck like that, you don't need to win a single battle on the ground to hurt an army. You just need patience, precision, and enough range to reach it. This isn't a new idea, and it's worth giving you the older context first, because that's what makes the 2026 campaign so significant. Ukraine has been probing this bottleneck for years. Back in October 2022, Ukraine's security service, the SBU, carried out its first attack on the Kerch Bridge itself, using a truck bomb that collapsed two sections of the road deck and damaged the rail line running alongside it. Russia blamed Ukrainian intelligence chief Kirylo Budanov directly. Ukraine denied it at the time, calling the accusation nonsense, though by July 2023, a senior Ukrainian defense official publicly confirmed Kyiv's role. In July 2023, Ukraine hit the bridge again, this time with naval drones, and Russian officials admitted that one span of the road portion could not be repaired. Around the same period, in June 2023, Ukraine struck the Chonhar bridges directly using British-supplied Storm Shadow cruise missiles, according to Russian investigators cited by the RIA news agency. Saldo appeared on camera, standing over craters in the roadway, insisting repairs would be quick, while Crimean head Sergei Aksenov confirmed there were no casualties, that traffic was continuing on reserve routes. A Ukrainian regional official at the time, Yuri Sobolevsky, put it plainly. The strike was a blow to military logistics, and just as importantly, a psychological blow, a reminder that there was no place in the region the occupying forces could feel entirely safe. That was 3 years ago. The pattern being established then is the same pattern playing out now, just at a much larger scale and with much more capable weapons. Fast forward to 2026, and the tools available to Ukraine have changed dramatically. According to reporting from Forbes military technology writer David Hambling, Ukraine's campaign escalated sharply starting in June, built around domestically produced long-range strike systems rather than scarce imported Western missiles. Central to this is a drone called the Firepoint FP2, carrying a roughly 350-pound warhead with first-person view guidance, allowing operators to steer it into precise structural targets rather than simply lobbing it in the general direction of a bridge. Ukrainian units have paired this with a tactic some open-source analysts have nicknamed the double tap: hit the bridge once to damage it, wait for Russian repair crews and equipment to arrive, then hit it again, this time targeting the repair effort itself. There's also a newer, faster missile called Ruta, AI-guided, carrying a heavier 500-pound warhead, also aimed specifically at load-bearing supports rather than the road surface. The goal with all of this isn't simply to crater a road for a news cycle. It's to make repair itself prohibitively costly, so that even when Russian engineers patch one crossing, the underlying structure remains, as the UK's defense assessment once put it about a different bridge, structurally undermined. Ukraine's own military has given this campaign a name: Logistics Lockdown. According to reporting from Ukrinform, the operation was officially launched in early June 2026, and by mid-July had reached what the outlet described as an unprecedented scale. In the month of June alone, Ukrainian forces conducted precision strikes on 15 separate bridges, 8 of them railway bridges, 7 of them road bridges, spread across the network connecting Crimea, Kherson, and Zaporizhia to the rest of Russian-held territory and to Russia proper. This is not a single dramatic strike followed by a press release. This is closer to a siege, conducted with drones and missiles instead of soldiers on the ground, methodically working through a target list built from years of accumulated intelligence about how the Russian military actually moves supplies. The Institute for the Study of War, a widely cited Washington-based research group that tracks the conflict daily using open-source military reporting, documented a specific cluster of these strikes in detail. According to the Institute, in the weeks around mid-July 2026, Ukrainian forces struck the Chonhar road bridge, the Henichesk road bridge, the Stylovyi road bridge, the Armyansk road bridge, and a road bridge east of a settlement called Vorona. Taken together, these crossings form the primary road network supporting Russian forces across the entire southern theater. The Institute noted that many of these bridges were damaged rather than fully destroyed in each individual strike, but that the cumulative effect was to reduce traffic capacity and force Russian logistics planners into slower, longer, and more exposed alternative routes. Some of the strikes, per open-source reporting cited by the Institute, were carried out using the same Firepoint drones mentioned earlier, alongside a newer long-range system called Behemoth. Let's go back to that June 7th strike on Chonhar in more detail, because it's a useful case study in how this campaign actually plays out in real time, hour by hour, rather than just as a headline. According to the Kyiv Independent, which confirmed the operation directly with Ukraine's military, the strike used Firepoint drones together with the Behemoth long-range aircraft and was a joint effort between the Code 9, 2 drone unit, and the 1st Separate Assault Battalion. Saldo, the Russian-installed Kherson official, went public first, claiming the bridge had been damaged even before Ukraine's own confirmation landed. He then announced that the Dzhankoi checkpoint, the administrative crossing point between occupied Crimea and occupied Kherson region, would be closed, citing security reasons. The Kyiv Independent noted it could not independently verify every detail of the Russian side's account, which is exactly the kind of honest caveat a responsible outlet includes, and exactly the kind of caveat this script is including too. What's independently verifiable is this: the strike happened, Ukraine's military confirmed carrying it out, and a Russian occupation official responded by shutting down a major crossing point. Those 3 facts alone tell you the operation achieved at least some of its intended disruption. 3 days later, according to reporting from Kyiv Post, another route into the region was hit. Saldo said a bridge connecting the town of Henichesk to the Arabat Spit, an alternative route that had grown in importance precisely because other crossings kept getting damaged, was targeted early on Wednesday morning. Andriy Kovalenko, who heads Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation, said publicly that the Chonhar bridge had in fact been destroyed in the broader wave of strikes, and accused Russian authorities of downplaying the extent of the damage to the public. This is a pattern that shows up again and again in this conflict. The occupying administration tends to minimize damage in public statements, while Ukrainian officials tend to describe the same events in maximalist terms. The truth, as best independent analysts can tell, usually sits somewhere between the two, which is exactly why serious reporting on this subject leans on satellite imagery, geolocated video, and multiple independent confirmations, rather than taking either side's press release at face value. So what has all of this actually done to the Russian forces and administration relying on this network? For that, we turn to some of the most detailed on-the-ground reporting available from Al Jazeera, published in mid-June 2026. Their reporting describes occupied Crimea as, in the words of one resident they quoted, an island surrounded by war. Since mid-May 2026, Ukrainian drones have been attacking hundreds of trucks carrying fuel, ammunition, and other supplies traveling from southwestern Russia to Crimea across what's sometimes called the land bridge, the strip of occupied Ukrainian territory connecting Russia to the peninsula. The drone operators involved in this campaign, according to the report, sit in bunkers as far as 200 kilometers, or roughly 124 miles, away from the roads they're targeting, using drones that also scatter small anti-vehicle mines along the routes, mines weighing only about 500 grams or just over a pound, equipped with magnetic or motion sensors. Cargo ships attempting to bring fuel and food into Crimea or carrying steel and grain out of occupied southeastern Ukraine have also come under attack. Volodymyr Fesenko, who heads the Kyiv-based Penta think tank, was quoted describing these strikes as illustrating just how vulnerable Crimea actually is, despite years of Russian investment in air defense and fortification around the peninsula. And the visible everyday consequence for ordinary people living under occupation has been fuel shortages severe enough that authorities have had to restrict fuel sales at gas stations in cities like Yevpatoria, a resort city on Crimea's Black Sea coast, with residents photographed lining up in queues that didn't exist a year earlier. This is worth pausing on because it's easy to talk about bridges and troop numbers in the abstract and lose sight of what a broken supply line actually looks like on the ground. It looks like a fuel station in Crimea rationing gasoline to civilians. It looks like Russian military trucks taking hours-long detours over roads that were never built to carry that kind of traffic. It looks like ammunition and spare parts sitting in a depot on one side of a damaged bridge, while the units that need them wait on the other side. According to the UK Ministry of Defence's assessment from earlier in the campaign, when the Antonivsky road bridge in occupied Kherson was struck repeatedly, Russia managed only superficial repairs, and British intelligence assessed the structure remained, in their words, structurally undermined, meaning it could bear light traffic but not the weight of heavy military vehicles. With that route effectively closed to serious logistics, the UK assessment noted that ground resupply for the several thousand Russian troops stationed west of the Dnieper River was almost certainly reliant on just 2 pontoon ferry crossing points, improvised, vulnerable, and slow. The ministry's blunt conclusion was that even if Russia carried out significant repairs, the crossings would remain a key vulnerability, forcing Russian troops in that sector to depend heavily on whatever stockpiles they had managed to accumulate in advance. Now, that figure, several thousand troops relying on pontoon crossings, comes from a specific, narrower assessment tied to one river crossing at one point in the war. It is not the same as the 50,000 figure in this video's title, but it illustrates the mechanism at work, and it's part of why some analysts and commentary sites have extrapolated much larger numbers when looking at the entire southern logistics network rather than one river crossing in isolation. One such assessment, published by a military analysis outlet, argues that with Ukraine now targeting essentially every major bridge connecting Crimea to the southern mainland, not just one crossing, but the Chonhar, Henichesk, Stylovyi, Armyansk, and Verona routes together, the cumulative effect goes well beyond isolating a few thousand troops on one riverbank. That outlet describes the strategy as a shift from what it calls localized disruption toward theater-level logistical isolation, arguing that tens of thousands of Russian troops across the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia fronts depend, in some fashion, on the broader Crimea-Kherson-Zaporizhzhia corridor to sustain combat operations, even if their supplies pass through several different crossing points rather than a single named road. We're flagging this clearly as an analytical estimate from a commentary source, not an official confirmed troop count from a government body, because that distinction matters, and a channel that blurs the line between the two isn't doing its viewers any favors. Let's talk about what Russia has been doing in response, because a siege campaign like this doesn't happen in a vacuum, and the other side adapts. Russian authorities have consistently downplayed the damage in public statements, a habit that goes back years. Saldo has repeatedly promised quick repairs and framed the strikes as meaningless gestures that don't affect what Russian officials still call their special military operation. After earlier strikes on the Crimean Bridge itself, Russian officials installed what they described as special anti-sabotage barriers, intended to protect the structure from both surface and underwater drones, according to reporting on Ukraine's intelligence directorate. Whether similar hardened defenses can realistically be extended across every minor road bridge in a network this size, when Ukraine's strategy explicitly targets the entire web of crossings rather than one iconic structure, is an open question that even Russian military bloggers have raised publicly, with some of them, according to CNN's reporting, openly criticizing what they see as a sluggish response from the Russian Defense Ministry to the scale of the disruption. CNN's own reporting on this, published in June 2026, adds another layer worth including here. Citing a source referred to as Molin, speaking to CNN, the report describes how Ukraine has obtained the means to run a large-scale drone campaign aimed at cutting Crimea off from its main supply roads, while simultaneously complicating Russian logistics along the entire front line, not just in the south. The report notes that 20 Russian trains, many of them carrying fuel, have been targeted since January 2026 alone, spread across multiple sectors of the front, and that Ukraine has also begun targeting the port of Mariupol, a strategic and industrial hub on the Sea of Azov under Russian occupation, which Ukraine's National Guard claims has been completely cut off from power, further hampering Russian logistics in that area. A popular Russian military blogger quoted in the piece, writing under the name Too Major, described the campaign as knocking out oil refineries in the south, creating fuel and logistics problems, while Ukraine simultaneously grounds civilian aviation in parts of Russia, using what the blogger called caravans of drones. When commentators sympathetic to the Russian side are publicly complaining about the pace and effectiveness of their own government's response, that's a data point worth taking seriously, because it's not coming from Kiev, it's coming from inside the tent. Let's take a step back and talk about where that 50,000 figure might actually be coming from, because tracing a number back to its likely origin is exactly the kind of honest digging a serious channel should do instead of just repeating a title and moving on. Searching through recent reporting, the number 50,000 does show up prominently in the context of this war, but attached to a completely different story. In late May 2025, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told journalists that Russia was massing more than 50,000 troops near Ukraine's northeastern Sumy region in what he described as an attempt to carve out a 10-kilometer buffer zone along the border. That figure was reported by Euronews and by the Kyiv Independent, both citing Zelensky directly. A separate report, roughly a month later, drawing on an Associated Press interview with Ukraine's military commander, Colonel General Oleksandr Syrsky, described Ukrainian forces as having stalled that Sumy offensive and noted that, in doing so, Ukraine had effectively prevented Russia from redeploying as many as 50,000 troops to other, more active sectors of the front. Neither of those stories has anything to do with a road into Crimea. They're about a troop buildup near Sumy, roughly a year before the Chonhar Bridge campaign even began. It's entirely possible that somewhere in the churn of online commentary, that 50,000 figure from the Sumy buildup got picked up, detached from its original context, and reattached to the much newer, unrelated story about Ukraine's logistics campaign in the south. This happens constantly in fast-moving conflict coverage. Numbers travel faster than the context that explains them, and a figure that was accurate in May 2025 can end up misapplied to an entirely different battlefield story a year later. We're walking you through that not to accuse anyone of deliberately lying, but because understanding how a number mutates as it spreads online is, frankly, more useful to you as a viewer than just accepting it at face value. There's a second, separate 50,000 figure worth mentioning too, because it adds yet another layer of context to how crowded this particular number has become in reporting on this war. According to the Critical Threats Assessment from Critical Threats, published in early August 2026, Russia has reportedly been preparing to receive as many as 50,000 North Korean troops, a figure tied to ongoing military cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang that has expanded steadily since North Korean units were first confirmed fighting in Russia's Kursk region back in late 2024. That number, again, is about troop reinforcement flows into Russia's broader war effort, not about any single road or bridge in occupied southern Ukraine. So by our count, there are at least two well-documented, entirely separate 50,000 figures already circulating in serious reporting about this war before you even get to the title of tonight's video. That's exactly the kind of environment where a number can get borrowed and repurposed without anyone intending to mislead. And it's exactly why we spent the opening of this video being upfront about what we could and couldn't confirm. Now let's go a little deeper on the mechanics of how Ukraine is actually pulling this logistics campaign off, because the technology side of this story is genuinely remarkable and doesn't get nearly as much attention as the troop numbers do. The Firepoint FP2 drone, central to this campaign according to Forbes' reporting, represents a shift in Ukrainian domestic manufacturing that's happened largely out of public view. Unlike the smaller first-person view drones that dominated early battlefield reporting from this war, systems built primarily to destroy tanks and infantry at close range, the FP2 is a long-range strike platform, carrying a warhead, heavy enough to meaningfully damage bridge infrastructure, while still retaining first-person view guidance that lets a human operator steer it into a precise structural point, rather than relying purely on pre-programmed coordinates. That distinction matters enormously in bridge strike operations, because a bridge deck is a relatively small, hardened target, and a drone that can be manually corrected in its final seconds of flight is far more likely to hit a load-bearing support than one flying a fixed trajectory. The newer Ruda missile, also referenced in Forbes' coverage, adds artificial intelligence-assisted guidance on top of a heavier 500-pound warhead, giving Ukrainian forces a second, faster option for the same category of target. Layer on top of that the double-tap tactic, striking a damaged bridge a second time specifically to hit the repair crews and equipment sent to fix it, and you start to see why Russian engineers have struggled to keep pace. It's not just that the bridges are being hit, it's that the act of fixing them has become dangerous in itself, which changes the entire cost calculation for Russian military logistics planners. It's also worth giving a bit more history on why this stretch of southern Ukraine became such a critical artery for Russia in the first place, because none of this happened by accident. When Russian forces swept through southern Ukraine in the opening weeks of the full-scale invasion in February and March 2022, they rapidly seized Kherson City and large parts of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions, effectively linking up occupied Crimea with Russian-controlled territory further east toward Donetsk, and ultimately Russia itself. This corridor, often referred to informally as the Land Bridge, was one of the most significant territorial achievements of the entire invasion because it solved a problem Russia had struggled with since annexing Crimea in 2014. How to reliably supply a peninsula that has no land connection to Russia proper except across a strait crossed by a single bridge, the Kerch Bridge, which even Russian planners understood to be a vulnerable single point of failure. Once the land bridge was established, road and rail routes running through Kherson and Zaporizhzhia became, alongside the Kerch Bridge itself, the backbone of Russian logistics for the entire southern half of the war. That's precisely why Ukraine's Kherson counteroffensive in the autumn of 2022 was considered so strategically significant at the time. And it's precisely why, 4 years later, that same stretch of territory remains one of the most fought-over logistics corridors in the entire conflict. The names may have changed, Chonhar and Armyansk, instead of the city of Kherson itself, but the underlying strategic logic, controlling the arteries that feed Crimea, has remained constant since the very first weeks of this war. There's also a wider strategic picture here that connects this southern logistics campaign to the broader trajectory of the war. And it's worth being honest about the fact that Ukraine's position elsewhere on the front is far from uniformly positive. According to assessments from Critical Threats, an organization that publishes detailed daily campaign analysis, Russian forces have continued grinding offensive operations elsewhere, including pressure around Pokrovsk in Donetsk region and encirclement attempts in parts of Kharkiv region near Vovchansk in early August 2026. This matters for context, because it shows that Ukraine's logistics campaign against Crimea in the south is not happening because Ukraine is comfortably winning the broader war. It's happening precisely because Ukraine, facing manpower and equipment constraints on multiple fronts simultaneously, has concluded that attacking the enemy's ability to sustain itself logistically is a more efficient use of limited resources than trying to match Russia head-on in grinding infantry assaults everywhere at once. Cutting a supply road doesn't require the manpower that holding or retaking a city does. It requires range, precision, and patience, and those happen to be exactly what Ukraine's domestic drone industry has been optimized to deliver over the past 2 years. It's also worth noting, in the interest of full honesty, that Russia has run its own version of this playbook against Ukraine in other sectors. According to reporting from Russian state-linked outlet TASS, citing a military expert named Andrei Moroshko, Russian forces claimed in July 2026 to have cut off a key supply road, the Krovnoye-Khotin route, feeding Ukrainian troops near the village of Khotin in Sumy region, describing it as the only remaining resupply route for that Ukrainian grouping after another nearby road was severed. We're including this not to distract from the main story, but because a responsible geopolitical breakdown doesn't pretend that logistics warfare is a one-way street. Both militaries in this conflict have identified the same lesson. In a war of attrition, cutting your opponent's supply lines can be more decisive than winning any single firefight, and both sides are now actively trying to do it to each other in different sectors at the same time. So where does that leave the actual claim in front of us tonight? The idea that Ukraine has blocked the only road keeping 50,000 Russian troops supplied? Here's the honest, complete picture, pulling every verified thread together. Ukraine has not struck a single isolated road. It has run a sustained multi-target campaign since early June 2026, confirmed by its own military, documented independently by the Institute for the Study of War, and covered in detail by Forbes, the Kyiv Independent, Kyiv Post, Ukrinform, Al Jazeera, and CNN, against essentially the entire network of bridges and crossings connecting occupied Crimea to occupied southern Ukraine, including the Chonhar, Henichesk, Stylovyi, Armyansk, and Henichesk crossings. The UK Ministry of Defense has separately confirmed that several thousand Russian troops west of the Dnieper River are reliant on just 2 pontoon crossings, after heavier bridges were damaged beyond safe use for military traffic. Reporting from Al Jazeera documents real, visible consequences inside occupied Crimea, including fuel rationing for civilians and hundreds of trucks attacked along the land bridge route from Russia. And while this specific figure of 50,000 troops tied to one single road has not been officially confirmed by any named government source, it falls within the broad range of estimates that military analysts have floated when describing how many Russian personnel across the southern front depend, in some form, on this now heavily disrupted corridor. The headline number may be rounded, borrowed, or extrapolated. The underlying military reality it's pointing toward is not exaggerated. It's happening, it's documented, and it's ongoing as of the most recent reporting available. Before we close, a quick and honest accounting of where this story stands and what remains uncertain, because that transparency matters more than any single dramatic claim. The strikes on the Chonhar, Henichesk, Stylovyi, Armyansk, and Antonivsky bridges are independently confirmed through Ukrainian military statements, Russian occupation officials' own admissions, and third-party reporting from the Institute for the Study of War, the Kiev Independent, Kiev Post, and Forbes. The fuel shortages and civilian rationing in Crimea are documented by Al Jazeera through on-the-ground reporting and quoted local sources. The pontoon crossing dependency for troops west of the Dnieper comes from a direct UK Ministry of Defense assessment. What remains contested or unverified includes the exact scale of Russian troop numbers dependent on any single crossing point, since neither side publishes precise logistics figures, the true extent of damage claimed by Ukrainian officials like Andriy Kovalenko versus the more minimized damage described by Russian occupation officials like Vladimir Saldo, and any claims from state-aligned outlets on either side, including Russian claims about their own successes cutting Ukrainian supply lines near Khotin, which we've included here for balance, but which rely on a single-named military commentator rather than independent verification. One more piece of research worth including before we close, because it adds useful texture to the bigger picture, comes from the OSW Center for Eastern Studies, a Warsaw-based research institute that publishes detailed daily analysis of the war. Their assessment from late June 2026, titled around the phrase Crimea's supply route at risk, placed this logistics campaign inside a wider frame of Ukrainian state finances and manpower pressures. The same report noted that Ukraine's parliament had passed budget amendments increasing defense spending, funded substantially through European Union support mechanisms, including a large loan facility running through 2027. That detail matters because a sustained drone and missile campaign like logistics lockdown isn't free. Firepoint drones, Behemoth long-range aircraft, and Ruda missiles all require sustained domestic production capacity. And domestic production capacity requires financing, materials, and factories that keep running even under regular Russian missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian industrial infrastructure. The same OSW report also described difficult conditions elsewhere on the front, including fighting inside the town of Kostiantynivka in Donetsk region, where Ukrainian defenders were reportedly resupplying troops, predominantly on foot, due to intense pressure on ground routes. That detail is a useful reminder that Ukraine's southern logistics campaign against Crimea isn't happening in isolation from resource constraints elsewhere. Every drone, every missile, and every trained operator assigned to hitting the Chonhar Bridge is a resource not available for some other pressing need on some other stretch of the front. Understanding that trade-off is part of understanding why Ukraine chose a logistics-focused strategy in the south in the first place, rather than attempting a large-scale ground offensive to physically retake the territory. It's also worth noting how Russian and Ukrainian narratives around this entire campaign continue to diverge even now, months into the operation. Russian officials and state-aligned outlets have consistently framed each individual strike as a minor, quickly repaired inconvenience, part of a broader pattern of downplaying setbacks that goes back to the earliest days of the full-scale invasion. Ukrainian officials, by contrast, have increasingly used language suggesting total or near-total severance of the network, terms like completely cut off showing up in statements from Ukraine's National Guard regarding the port of Mariupol, and destroyed rather than damaged in Andriy Kovalenko's characterization of the Chonhar Bridge. Independent, named analytical bodies like the Institute for the Study of War have generally taken the middle position, supported by available evidence, describing the bridges as damaged rather than destroyed in most individual strikes, while acknowledging that the cumulative, repeated nature of the campaign has meaningfully reduced traffic capacity across the entire network. That middle position, unglamorous as it might be compared to either side's framing, is the one best supported by verifiable open-source evidence as of this recording, and it's the position this script has tried to reflect throughout. What's your read on all this? Does a campaign like this, quietly grinding away at bridges and checkpoints week after week, actually change the course of a war the way a single dramatic battlefield victory might? Or is it more of a slow bleed that shapes the endgame without ever producing a headline, moment people will remember years from now? Drop your take in the comments. I'd genuinely like to see where people land on this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.